Now, with all the cool new additional 3D features in Photoshop CS5 extended, we mustn't forget some of the earlier 3D features, namely the 3D postcards, which are actually really quite powerful in giving you some really interesting effects when you just experiment with them and try some interesting things. Like in this case, we're going to create a fire logo. It's actually a really interesting effect I did a while back, and it's an interesting use of 3D postcards. And we're going to start with this simple graphic of this fire, which I need to first extract from this background. So I'm going to go ahead and go in the channels palette and just do this real easy by going and toggling through each of the channels to see which channel area covers the most. And I can see the red channel is going to be my best option here. So I'm going to go ahead and load the red channel as an active selection by holding down the Command key on Mac, Control on Windows, and just simply click on the channel icon there. And we'll reselect the RGB channel and go back to the Layers panel. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this selected area to its own layer by pressing Command J. Now if I turn off the background, you can see that the fire has been nicely extracted. However, there is still a little bit of the black background haze that's kind of around the edges here. Now here's a cool trick for taking care of that. And you can just go under the layer menu down to the very bottom. Now it goes off screen, but at the very bottom it says matting. And you're going to choose remove black matte. And when you do that, notice what it does. The area around it gets a little lighter, picking up that red color. It looks more realistic. So now what I want to do is I'm going to have a file that I'm going to build this graphic on. Now it's important that this file be perfectly square. In fact, you can see right now that it's at 9 by 9 inches at 125 pixels per inch. Now, I'm keeping it square because of the effect we're going to be applying on this is that we're going to be using a polar coordinates filter, and it works better if the image is perfectly square. So no matter what your dimensions are, make sure that they are even so that that they match up so that the image will be perfectly square. So let's go ahead and take our fire graphic and drag and drop it on into this document. And we're going to put it in free transform by pressing Command T. I'm just going to go over here to grab the middle control handle at the top and just squash this fire graphic down somewhat. And I'm also going to grab a side middle handle here and hold down the Option key on Mac, Alt on Windows, and stretch this out in both directions till it gets really kind of close to the edge. And then we're just going to take that fire element and drag it down closer to the bottom of the document. Now, let's go ahead and minimize this one and no longer need that file open. So now, with that graphic positioned at the bottom of the image, we're going to go under the Filter menu to Distort and choose Polar Coordinates. And we want to make sure that we have Rectangular to Polar selected. And we click OK, we get an interesting ring of fire going on here. It's really pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this down a little bit just to kind of help center it in the frame there. Now, notice there is a gap here on the top where the ends don't quite meet. Well, I'm going to fix that by just making a duplicate of this layer and then putting it in free transform and just rotating around on its axis so it really kind of closes in that gap. I don't want to close it up completely. I'm just going to leave a little bit of an open area there. Just it's a little bit of a break in the fire there. It looks pretty cool. So I'm going to merge these layers down and make it one layer. All right. So there's one element of our 3D logo. Now let's go ahead and create the other element by going and creating a new layer underneath this layer. If you simply hold down the Command key, Control on Windows, and click the new layer icon, pops a new layer underneath. So we're going to fill this layer with a color. I'm going to press Shift Delete. We're going to use 50% gray. And then we're going to run a filter. I want to get kind of like a carbon fiber type of look here. So I'm just going to fake it by going under Filter to Sketch Halftone Pattern. Now inside here, we're going to make sure that we have the pattern type set to dot. You have three choices here, circle, dot, and line. Let's go ahead and choose dot. And set the size to around 3 and the contrast to around 4. And we'll go ahead and click OK. So we got an interesting little pattern going on there. Well, I'm going to go ahead and drop the opacity of this down. I don't quite need it that vibrant, so I'm going to drop it down 50%. And then I'm going to go over here and apply a gradient. And we're going to mask this from the inside to the out. I'm actually going to drop that not quite as much. Let's do like 75. There we go. Now I'm going to put a layer mask on this layer containing that, that pattern. And we're going to fade it. I want it to fade from the middle on out to black. So we're just going to grab this foreground, the transparent background layer, and make sure that the reverse item up here in the options bar is checked on. And we're going to use a radial gradient. I'm just going to start in the middle of the document and just drag out to the edge where the fire is. And it should mask the image quite nicely just like that. Let's do that one more time. Just kind of center it up. There we go. So that's looking pretty good, giving us a little bit of interesting depth and interest to our graphic here. Now I have an element here that I've already created, which is a text element that I'm going to go ahead and take and drag and drop it over. It's already got a simple bevel and emboss layer style on it to give the text a little bit of depth. But we're going to fill in the text with our fire graphic. Remember the fire we extracted? I'm going to take that same graphic element and drag it over once again. Now this time, I'm going to go ahead and distort it down so it kind of covers the area of the text. And then I'm going to go under Filter and choose Blur, Motion Blur. And we're going to give it a good size blur, about a 500 pixel blur will look fine. Angle set to 0 so it goes from left to right. And then click OK. And then we're going to clip that graphic inside of the text by creating a clipping group. So I'm going to hold down the Option key on Mac, Alt on Windows, and click right in between the layers, and it clips that graphic right inside the text. Looks pretty good. All right, so now our elements are in place to create the 3D. So the first element I want to create is these two elements that make up this text layer. I'm going to make a 3D postcard. So select both layers, go under 3D, and choose New 3D Postcard from Layer. Now, depending on what type of effects you've got going on in each of these individual elements, they may not look exactly right once they've been converted to 3D, but that's gonna be okay because it'll look right when you go to render the 3D object. And we'll just go ahead and create another 3D. I'm gonna select the next layer, which is the Ring of Fire. Make a 3D postcard out of that. And then lastly, the layer containing the pattern, which I'm gonna go ahead and make a new layer and fill it with black just so we can have a background element that transparency can fall on within the 3D object. So again, I'm going to select both of those layers, the pattern and the black layer that I've created, and choose New 3D Postcard from Layer. So you can make a 3D postcard from one single selected layer or a couple of some selected layers. So now I have 3 3D postcards. Now these are in 3D space. Now they don't have any extrusions or any depth like you would expect a 3D object. They are in a 3D space, so we can move it around just like that, as you can see. But we need to merge them together so they will interact with each other. I'll step forward here. So they will interact with each other, generating reflections and shadows and things. They're not going to do that if they're still 3 separate individual 3D objects. So what I need to do is go ahead and merge them. Now you can only merge 2 3D layers at a time inside Photoshop. So I'm going to select the topmost layer, the one just below it, go under 3D, merge 3D layers. It's going to go and merge them together. Now this is different from merging layers regularly, whereas you merge layers and that's it, they're done, they're combined. Merging 3D layers still maintains the 3D editability of the individual objects, even though they are in one single 3D layer. So once I've gone ahead and converted or merged all of these 3D objects, in a moment you'll be able to see that I can take my 3D object rotation tool and move this object around in 3D space. And you can see that they're spaced out by default already, so I can get some pretty interesting angles just by maneuvering this around and getting a really interesting 3D logo effect. So let's go ahead and reposition it here, and I'm just going to nudge it up a little bit. Now, I want this to have some reflective properties. I'm going to add some lights to it as well. So let's go ahead and open up the 3D panel. This allows you to manage those individual objects even though they're all in one single layer. So here in the mesh section of my 3D panel, I've got all the different meshes that make up these different shapes. So I've got this background layer selected, which is this layer 2 right here, which is that pattern in the background. I want that to be a reflective surface so it reflects the Ring of Fire and this text here. So we'll go into the mesh, or the materials section rather, and I can see that layer 2 is the one I want. I'm going to go and set the reflection property to around 50, and that's all set. Now I don't see the reflection because I have to render that effect. So Before we do that, let's add a light. So we have no lights on this scene. We can't have a reflection without light. So let's add a new spotlight to our scene here. And you can see the wireframe of the light. If you do not see the wireframe, just go into this little menu at the bottom of the 3D panel, very first icon, and just choose 3D light here, and you can see that wireframe. So now we need to reposition the light using the 3D light tool. So I'm going to take the 3D slide tool and actually bring the light out a little bit. So I'm clicking and dragging down. It actually slides the light toward me. And let's go grab the other light rotation tool and rotate this light around so it shines on my logo. All right. And let's just go ahead and reposition it right up here. And you can see the lights shining on that logo. And I think I need to adjust the angle of the light just slightly. There we go. Now the shadow properties are already in place on these 3D objects, so I don't need to tell it to render the shadows. If I needed to choose to tell it not to render shadows, then I can turn those items off right in here in the mesh panel. But to see our finished product, I'm going to go ahead and save first, because this is a good habit to develop, is saving your documents before you go and render them, and save them often. But to see our finished product, let's go ahead into the quality menu here in the scene section of the 3D panel and choose Ray Trace Draft. And it's going to do a progressive render. Now notice how faded the graphic looks. Look how much more vibrant it gets once we do a full render on here. And I can see already that my reflections are a little strong, especially around the edge there with that ring of fire effect. So let's go over here and drop that down to like 25. And it will do a re-render. It's going to, now depending on the speed of your system, it will take a moment to render certain effects when you create them this way. But you can see right now that it's actually reflecting the text. Looks pretty good. And we're getting a much interesting effect being able to take advantage of these 3D objects. Now, again, these are two-dimensional graphics placed in a 3D space, so we have much more flexibility on the positioning of our graphics, how we want to view them. So there's a good render of my object. If I wanted to change the angle, I could just go over here and grab this object, rotate it around, and it will go ahead and do another render, and I'll get another really interesting result each and every time. And this is taking a huge advantage of being able to use 3D in a very creative way. So experiment with it. Try not just the Reposition features, which are great, but play with the other 3D features like the 3D postcard, and you can do some really, really interesting stuff with a little bit of experimentation.